We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices. Today we have our next guest, Matthew French, founder of Awesomely Authentic and assistant director for employer relations at UNC Charlotte. Matthew, how are we doing today?
I'm awesome. Thank you so much, Christina, for having me on today. I'm super excited to chat more with you and to teach the children, as they say.
Yes, that is what they say. If we want to start off, just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns. And we're both Tauri. How was your birthday? How did you celebrate yourself?
Yes. So Matthew French, I go by he, they pronouns. I am a Taurus baby. So May 10th was my birthday here recently. I got a long massage and then just like hung out in my fairy garden and looked at birds. It was quite relaxing. I mean, of course, with like a couple drinks kind of thrown in there just to really
absolutely
make it a fun time. So yeah, founder of Awesomely Authentic. It'll be 1 year anniversary, June 1st.
Congrats.
1 full year of Awesomely Authentic. Girl, it has been crazy. Just the amount of love and outpouring, and this will be my first June, like kind of Pride month where I'm geared up and I'm moving.
Yeah.
And so the amount of employers and government entities that are asking me for trainings, and it's just excited to be a part of the growth and journey of so many different areas and industries.
Yeah, absolutely. So many folks I'm sure are reaching out. I know we talked about that too with June coming up as well. What really inspired you to get into the inclusion space, specifically with LGBTQ plus folks, and helping them, navigate their career path and really, driving the community?
Sure. So I think it's a few different things, right? Like whenever we have our life experiences. So I came from a very small rural town called Pocahontas, Virginia. Google it. It's very small. I graduated with 28 other students in my class.
Oh.
And that was a public school, mind you. So very small. So there's that piece of me as being a rural queer person. I didn't come out until I later went to Old Dominion University, where I kind of got involved in LGBTQ issues and activism. It was around the time of Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Yeah.
And I went to Norfolk, Virginia, which is one of the largest naval bases right there, Norfolk Naval Station. And so I went there and protested Don't Ask, Don't Tell with like 3 other people and signs and, that whole type of thing. But what I found to be my strength is my way of approaching people. And I think it comes from my rural background, that like Southern charm. It's like something that everyone seems to be like usually gravitates towards, right? Because that Southern charm can be very warm. And so a lot of the DEI conversations, especially around LGBTQ plus identities, can be scary to people. They don't want to mess up, right? They don't understand sometimes. And so I really got involved by seeing how I could change people's minds, who people didn't think their minds could be changed or educated on a particular topic. So I always did that kind of through my career coaching, working at universities and colleges. I also did it through, nonprofits, volunteering here and there. But luckily, I have a mentor / annoying older brother / our director at UNC Charlotte. He's not really my older brother, but he definitely reminds me of an annoying older brother. He encouraged me to start my own thing around LGBTQ plus identities and career and work and creating a more inclusive community. And so I made the leap. I was terrified. I've never done anything like it before because if it was an entrepreneurial thing. And if I failed, it was me failing. But I'm happy to say I'm truly blessed with what all I've received so far just over this past year. And it just feeds my soul daily. To get up and know that I'm helping this person find their dream job as a queer person of color. I'm helping this company hire more LGBTQ plus people across the spectrum by working on their recruitment. I'm helping this university work better with their LGBTQ plus students in their career development. So I'm making like really large impacts, which is just like super, super cool when you think about it in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, absolutely. It's the whole system from, especially from students who are recently graduating, looking for internships, looking for full-time jobs. You have employers and potential employees really asking, questions around inclusivity, and
Mm.
really how they're supporting their LGBTQ plus folks at the organization. And I know in our initial conversation, one of the things that we talked about is what can we tangibly do for employers and employees as well. And one of the ways or areas of impact is throughout that application process, right? So you mentioned that you're really passionate about having employers ask in that process gender identity and having the option to share if the potential employee would like to, if they are part of the LGBTQ plus community. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of this, especially you mentioned that people are afraid to kind of engage in these conversations or they're not sure if that's even legal to do. Walk us through your thoughts on that.
Sure, yeah. And so yeah, really I would say the core foundation of Awesomely Authentic is wanting people to be authentic in their careers, and they can be at work and be whoever they are. But part of that includes ensuring that it's equitable across the line of identities within companies. Currently, companies only report on things usually around veteran status, disability, race, and gender, but usually just cisgender perspective, so male and
Right.
female. That information, some of it's asked for by the government, but again, it's information that you are opted into if you want to, right?
Right.
So there are other types of ways where employers can take this information, like asking, what is your gender identity? What is your sexual orientation? Allowing you for opting into that is important. The reason it is important is, one, it shows that the company is welcoming of those identities. They see those identities as valuable. Two, when it comes time for, let's say, recruiters to recruit for diversity,
Yeah.
if they don't have a metric to measure that identity, then it's really hard for them to make the case that, hey, we should go to LGBT centers or LGBT student orgs to recruit from for possible talent pools, right? Because we can't measure that identity. So they can't tell if they're able to even hire any of those people, right? Because they don't have the data. Then it also helps on the inside for people who are already working there. It would give insight into how welcoming is your company, right? Because if you're losing more than half of your LGBT people on
Yeah.
turnover, then there's something wrong internally. And then you can work on that company culture piece. It's just super important. And a lot of recruiters get nervous about asking those questions. And a lot of their legal will say, ooh, stay away from those questions. Now, this is a key determination where again, I'm not a lawyer, but what I've read is that essentially you can put those questions as opt-in optional questions, right?
Right.
Even at the very end of your application or in a separate document all the way together, right? Maybe a separate form. Netflix does a really good job of this. I encourage anyone to check out Netflix's job application. It does such a great job of it. Now, what they do with that data, I am not completely sure, but my positive aspect would be that they're using it to ensure they're being representative of multiple identities in the hiring process. So whenever you're kind of thinking through all of those different aspects, right, we're thinking through our identity and all that fun stuff. What that's really going to do is it's going to allow for employers to demonstrate their LGBTQ plus inclusion. It's going to also help our identities stand out more, because again, if you're not going to be counted, it's just really hard to make a business case of why, especially since for many queer people, our identity is not visible, right? Like if you look at, sometimes I call it the optics of DEI, which is like, oh, we're hiring a new DEI person, so that person must be a person of color, right? You'll notice that a lot is that I feel like a lot of people of color are suddenly being pigeonholed into just C-suite level. Like it's just C-suite level for color people are those diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces. Whenever people of color can be in any of these large C-suites, it's more about the company looking at themselves internally and fixing those structural issues.
Got it. That definitely makes sense. And I know that we're talking more along the lines of companies and really the types of questions that need to be asked in the application process to ensure inclusivity. And I definitely agree with the metrics point of view as well in terms of you needed to relate it to the business and need to make a business case for time, money, and resources of just intentionally recruiting and building out your pipeline.
Mm.
How can companies, in your opinion, really make an intentional approach to recruiting LGBTQ plus folks? And we know that it's more than just celebrating Pride, it's celebrating Heritage Month, and having that executive or having that executive level person say that they identify with this community or gender identity. But how can people really think about a thoughtful strategy for that?
Totally. I think so. In the initial recruitment process, it's really building those very intentional relationships. So, getting involved in things like out in tech and mentoring LGBTQ plus techies, right?
Yeah.
Or being involved with Campus Pride, which is a nonprofit that connects employers to students, LGBTQ students. Ensuring that you have a really good connection with your local LGBT Chamber of Commerce and your LGBT centers and your LGBT student orgs. Because if you come around, if they just see you during the month of Pride, I'm sure it is very welcoming, right? It's very like, yay. But also we are very aware as queer people of queer baiting and companies know that there's the pride dollar, right? So that rainbow dollar speaks. And so we realize that. So when we're looking at a place we're working for, some of the things that we're looking for are those very specific, like a little more time put into it, right? So those mentoring areas, reaching out to those organizations that maybe need help, going to some of our most at risk and helping them, right? So whether it's our trans youth of color, right? Trans women who face homelessness, homicide, they face joblessness almost five times more than the national average. So doing things like that as a company, you can build up a pipeline, but you can also really demonstrate to the queer community, like we really do care about the community. So that's some good ways just to initially kind of get that recruitment piece out there. Then once you get them in the door, it's all about making sure that you are creating an environment where, as an employer, it's not your job, and it shouldn't be your job to control how people think and feel about topics. Now, what is your job is to make sure everyone feels safe to do their best work and to keep making money, right? That's kind of the end goal of a lot of this. So if you have an employee, you want to ensure you're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion training around intersectionality. So you can do a lot of training on race, but then if you don't do training on LGBTQ or maybe religion, then you could have a Black male gay male who was like, well, yeah, I feel supported on one side of my identity, but I don't feel supported on my other side. So you kind of negate all that work you've done. So always having an approach where it's looking at intersectionality and not just the boxes,
Absolutely. Opening up those boxes, if you will. Nobody is just, siloed into one category of a community or person. And, at the end of the day, people have human experiences as well. So I definitely appreciate that point too. And we've been talking a lot about, companies and employers and what they can do. And you mentioned that, you do a lot of career coaching as well. So I definitely wanted to ask what kind of advice you give to potential employees to really ask in the interview process to ensure that the company is actually committed to hitting these goals, if they are tracking any metrics aside from looking at social media and their website, when you have the opportunity to talk to someone in the interview process or ask to talk to someone else in the interview process.
Yeah, and that's always, so that is the key. And I think something that always cracks me up, Christina, is like when I talk to students or I talk to clients and they're just like, oh, like I really need this job. I'm like, so don't approach it from that type of feeling of like, because they need you. Without that, the longer that job is open, the more money they're losing, right? The more time they're losing, the more money they're going to have to spend to recruit more talent, right? So this company is hoping that you're a fit as well, right? So you want to make sure that you're fitting, that they fit you and what your goals are and what your values are, right? So it's a relationship, right? It's coming together for like, compromises and all that fun stuff. Now, When it comes to the idea of coming out and be coming out as LGBTQ plus or coming out around other non-visible, like maybe disabilities or religion or something like that, right? I always talk to clients, you need to make a choice, and it's really a choice for yourself
Yeah.
of, do you want to disclose? Do you not want to disclose? You know? And everyone's a little different. Some people don't think that their personal life intermingles with their professional life any, right? Like they go in, they clock in, they do their work, they leave, right? They're not going to Christmas parties or, sitting around and having a beer after. That's just not who they are. And that's totally cool. And so you really want to make sure that you are, I would say, taking note of everything on your resume and your experiences. And if you want to move it away from maybe an identity specific experience, focus specifically on the things you did, right? So instead of saying Pride LGBTQ student group, you could just put human rights community organization, right? And then you take out kind of the LGBT stuff. But then on the other side, a lot of people want to have that in there, right? It's part of their identity. So that's a great litmus test, is if you are going to disclose. If an employer doesn't want to hire you because you have, or doesn't want to bring you in for an interview because you have something queer on your resume, then that's a decision you have to make of like being okay with that, right? Being okay with not being invited in, because you have to decide if that's an employer you want to work with. Now, some questions that I find to be super useful, do not waste that time. I think this is probably the part of the interview that most interviewers waste so much, because you can do a 1-2 punch with really good questions.
Yeah.
I usually will say, if it's the first interview, keep it to 3 questions, mainly about the job, right?
Okay.
So that should be kind of your first thing. If you want to do maybe 2 about the job and then 1 about, a personal thing, we can totally do that. So let's say you're in that phone interview, you're doing the interview, your first 2 questions, the first one is asking about, I see here I'll be doing XYZ. Like, can you tell me about that process and how you all set that up? The other one could be about maybe teamwork, right? But the third one, if you're wanting to kind of gauge diversity, equity, and inclusion, some things you can do is, one you can ask is, hey, maybe you did some research beforehand, always important. Maybe you can say like, hey, I saw your company posted last summer about the Black Lives Matter movement and supporting it. And I would love to know what all has your company done to kind of keep that conversation going,
Yeah.
right? Another one can be something like, I really enjoy being involved in a company that likes to give back. Can you tell me about, does the company offer volunteer hours? And does the company do any volunteer initiatives together, right? So you can do things like that. You can also ask them how they define diversity, equity, and inclusion at their company, because it's going to be a little different everywhere. And it almost always doesn't include LGBTQ plus, again, because they don't measure us. So sometimes when you talk to a recruiter, that's not going to be the forefront of their mind, but that doesn't mean they don't have like a Pride ERG, like an employee resource group or something. But those are some great ways for you to kind of litmus test, like, how welcoming is the employer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that research piece is so important too, because if a company is outwardly saying, hey, we support Black Lives Matter, hey, we support Pride, and we're celebrating in XYZ ways, a great question is to say, okay, how are you celebrating Pride 365 days a year? Like, what is your actual commitment doing here? So I definitely think that's super important to ask as well. And going back to that retention piece, and again, the metrics piece as well, it's so hard to measure just inclusion and equity in the workplace, and everybody's doing it differently based on their goals, right? But in terms of measuring progress, measuring success wherever anybody is on that journey, do you recommend any KPIs or anything like that in terms of promotion and retaining LGBTQ folks at an organization?
Totally. So, I mean, one of the KPIs I've seen to be a little bit of the easier way. I call it the superhero challenge. And so, what the superhero challenge is you set up a Slack or a what's it called, Discord, and you're anonymous in there. Everyone's anonymous. Everyone, they come up with their name is a superhero alias, but it is for queer people in the company. And then once people feel comfortable, they can start saying who they are. What this does is it kind of gives people that moment to see the queer friendliness around them without having to immediately out themselves, right? This can also be really great for organizations that are splintered all around the country and the world, right? There are countries where being LGBT, you can still be put to death.
Yeah.
So you want to be aware of those employees and ensuring that you're, giving them a safe space as well. But for those KPIs, see how many people start in that group. How much does it grow after a year? And then after that first year, how many people have came out, right? And said who they were, right? Measuring your ERG engagement is a good way. And I don't mean by how many events your ERG is doing, but then that's putting more on the people within the organization where that's probably not their main job anyway.
Probably
right?
Not,
So it's more saying like how many employees and allies are coming and interested in that ERG, and giving that ERG funding, right? You can't expect things to just kind of happen without any sort of support, because you're asking people. This is a profession of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's also a love project for a lot of people who are in businesses and corporations working as ERG leaders. So I'm a big believer in also compensating ERG leaders for that type of time.
Yes, compensation is important.
Right, they need to be paid, or like I'm like, damn, at least give like some paid vacation or something like that they get.
Professional development, just I think compensation in any way that is possible definitely makes
I know, and it blows my mind like how much, and because they put in so much work. And I've met with a lot of the ERG leaders where I can just tell their heads are spinning, and I'm like, I got you. Like, we're going to take it piece by piece. But I think another good KPI, honestly, is when you start recruiting from queer types of talent pools, right? So you have your talent pools, which are where you're going to pull talent from, hoping that they will, interview, right? And then that will be more of your like recruitment pools, because you're going to be recruiting from those people. You'll notice that when you start going into some of these spaces, the intersectionality around queer people is vast, right? So not only are you going to be able to start hopefully kind of measuring some more of those other like LGBT identities, but I think also you'll see a rise in some of those other identities, right? Around race, religion, ability, things like that. But I think a good KPI simply is how, for your first year, is how many people have been trained in your offices, right? Like, we would like to have 50% of all of our community trained by the end of the year, right? Those little KPIs, they're small, but they help build a little bit, right? Because then it helps build their knowledge. The biggest piece to recruiting queer people is having an empathetic ear, listening to them, validating what they're saying, and seeing them as a human. Like, that is the biggest piece, I think, that is missing sometimes from DEI in general. DEI is very like policy, 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 policy. That is old diversity, equity, and inclusion approaches. We are past policy. We have the policies written down. The policies are there, but they're not working. So we need systemic things that come in, and we really have to start working on opening people's minds and hearts to experiences that are outside of the realm of understanding. I have not come up with a KPI to measure minds and hearts, but if anyone has any suggestions, I am all ears.
No, absolutely. And it's hard sometimes too to engage in these conversations. We're talking about identity. We're talking about very personal things. As you said, a lot of employee resource group leaders, especially for myself, it was a passion project. It was definitely personally related to what I believe in and is super important. And you're right, there is a difference between there is a policy of like, we are creating a safe space for our employees and this is how we're doing it, as opposed to there's actually a safe space manifesting in this organization, whether it's virtual or in person. In your opinion, what you've seen and kind of what you've heard from other folks, what is key to really creating those safe spaces to have hard conversations when you are bringing in people from all different backgrounds who have different levels of knowledge and just own personal experience as well? And everybody, again, is at a different part of their journey with specifically DEI work, but it's all interrelated. How do you really come into this space together and kind of open that up?
Yeah, and so part of my background also comes from teaching race, gender, sexuality, media studies courses. So I deal with freshmen and sophomores mostly. talking about these conversations, right? So you as the person, as an ERG leader, as a recruiter, as the person who is going to be leading this type of information or this type of drive, you have to go into with it personally. Don't go into it with now we've got to do this. We have to hit this line, and this line. If we do not, we have not met the metrics. That is going to turn everyone off. Everyone's going to be scared. It's just not going to work. You want to go into it with an open kind of like, I don't want to say like an open mindset that you are welcoming, right? You have to make it a welcoming environment. You're setting the tone for how this whole thing is going to be kind of taken in by people. So I always set up first and forward. The first thing I always tell students is I love having difficult conversations, and I will make sure that we are all safe while we're having difficult conversations. I said, 2, this is a learning space. If someone does make a boo-boo, and they very well make a boo-boo, I do not want anyone else to correct them. I will correct and chat with them, and then we'll have a conversation around it. I was like, this will not turn into a let's bash the person who misspoke for a second. And then I say, thirdly, I'm like, if you're not currently opening to hearing these conversations and being engaged with it, but maybe you disagree with the things I'm saying, I do ask that you keep those to yourself until after the session, and you and I can talk one-on-one about maybe the things you're currently struggling with to understand, to get you on to the next point. Mainly because I don't want it to turn into a fighting match between one side and the other side, you know? Setting that up has been perfect. I have never had a student leave my course, or
that's great. You didn't drop.
I've never had, you know, I did have one student one time, actually this past semester, he said the R word when we were talking about like a show that he thought was dumb. And I was like, oh, and I saw the kids' faces.
Yeah, it's
and
just
I was
like,
oh, right. And I was like, oh, buddy, I was like, you don't say that. He was like, why? And I was just like, oh, it's just because, you know, and when I correct people, I come at them with love. And I'm just like, oh, it's just like, you know, like, it's just not something that's acceptable. And, you know, it makes people feel like they're less than human when you use that language. So approaching it that way, being a DEI leader, there are different ways of approaching DEI. You can be very like, fight the power. You can be very empathetic. You can be very methodical and data driven. Everyone chooses their own way. Mine is very empathetic, and it has been the way that I personally think people respond to it a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely helpful. And I think setting those guidelines and boundaries up front to say, okay, this is the intention of the space we are creating, and also not putting it on people who do feel uncomfortable personally by the R word or by something someone said, of just like, oh, I need to speak up in this context and use that emotional labor to do that, instead of being present in this conversation and they're thinking about the whole time. So I think that definitely is really helpful. I think oftentimes folks say like, I am a good ally to the LGBTQ plus community, and this is why. Do you have any thoughts around intentional allyship that's not performative, especially in the workplace as well, when people, again, as you kind of mentioned, might be weary about having the like direct conversations around like identity and things like that?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember, like, identity and gender and sexuality, like all of this stuff has really been created. Literally, people just pull shit out of the air and they're like, well, this seems gay, like, right? So that type of thing. So it's all performative. So, I mean, there are times where I definitely lean into my performance of like a femininity in a gay male, right? Like, I'll just kind of like, girl, yes, you know, like, but that's in certain spaces. So some things that I do see at work a lot is I see a lot of females, usually cisgender females, who do not identify within the LGBTQ plus community, get really excited when there's a gay person around. I've always wanted a gay best friend. I'm like, we literally just met, so I'm not your best friend.
Just to be clear, no, I'm not. No,
yeah, right. Just so you were aware, girl. And there have been times, honestly, in my professional life where I've leaned into that because I knew I needed a job and that person had connections or whatever, and which is a whole other story. But don't. I think sometimes people get that confused as allyship. that's tokenizing. That is
Yes, those are
treating
different.
us like purses and
Yes.
accessories.
Mm-hmm.
So a way to be a good ally is if I'm in a new workplace and I'm just like, oh, me and my boyfriend Austin went to a bar this weekend. It was really cool. Instead of just going, oh my God, what? Oh, you're gay. That is so exciting. When did you come out to your mom and dad? Oh, how were they? Did they like it? Like, were your mom and dad upset? Oh, did they like kick you out of that? Like, that's always the same types of little things we get. Well, a better way to respond to that is, oh, that's awesome. How was the bar?
Yep, there we go.
That's how you demonstrate that inclusion without blinking an eye, and you just keep talking about the topic you were talking about and not just suddenly moving it over to boyfriend. Because if I want to share more about my relationship, and after that's how I'm kind of gauging you, is when I say my boyfriend Austin, I know in that moment in my head I have just come out to you, so now I'm reading
you're very aware, yeah,
right? And when they come at you just so like, I'm like, oh no.
Oh no,
like,
no. We tested the waters and I'm coming out of the water.
Right. I am over the like 18-year-old myself who loved that type of approach because I had just come out. I'm in the space where like I'm a human and like being gay is part of me, but I'm also gender queer. I also am rural. I like to play in cow poop and like go farming. I have 4 dogs. I have a loving, it's a lot of us. And it just sometimes the allyship can be difficult. So I would say just keep your mind on like what you were talking about. And then, if someone says like, oh, like I have a partner, don't ask them what gender their partner is, because a lot of people use the term partner now. They'll disclose that when they're ready. I think it's this like human thing that we all feel like we should know everything, right? Like we feel like we should know the information when it doesn't necessarily need to be known all the time.
No, absolutely. And you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong, but your coming out story is definitely something that's deeply personal. It's not something that you owe to anyone, to, especially if you first met them or if there's just no relationship. I feel like the bombardment of questions are just totally out there and very tokenizing as well, which is not a welcoming experience for anyone.
Totally. Yeah. And I think again, it'll depend. Like some people will have good experiences, bad experiences, but don't come out with like, but I always get the like, how did your parents take it? Like, when did you come out? Like always those things,
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I hear you say as well is a lot of people are using the term partner, which is really great, and not assuming that somebody has a wife, husband, girlfriend, whatever, because of whatever gender that they appear to be as well. And just using inclusive language too, I think is a huge piece of that kind of conversation too, to make people feel like they can share specifically, or they could just use partner, or they can just continue on and not share if they have a partner or not. It's just a different level of, sharing information, which is what you said as well.
Yeah, and it's so that, and a lot of that comes from this idea. It's called the sexual identity management theory. It's written by Plateau, but they talk about we use little signifiers that are almost like little breadcrumbs that lead us to decide of how much we share about ourselves or don't share about ourselves around sexuality specifically. And so it's so true. You look for little things. I would say probably the biggest gauge I can usually find now, while I do have issues with what it might mean for our community, RuPaul's Drag Race has really made it a little easier to find out who's at least an ally. Like they watch shows of queer people, but then the educational part then needs to come in, right? So I encourage my queer people in these spaces is look at someone's intent, right? Are they intentionally trying to tokenize you? Are they intentionally not listening to you when you say, oh, like, that made me feel weird, or that made me feel like a purse, or you try to teach them a language or a word, like do they say transvestite, which is a word you probably had to correct people on, right? So when you kind of think through those things, if you see consistently someone's not trying or learning, that's when you should probably maybe set boundaries between you and that person. But I heavily recommend, and I know this as queer people, we're putting on ourselves to teach people. I don't mind it because I am an educator. I put myself in this space, but hold your tongue as much as you can in that space if you don't know their intentionality right away behind it. Because if you attack someone whose intention is just to learn or ask a question, but you attack them on that, then that puts immediately in their mind, like, oh, like, I just was trying to learn, and that gay person just like totally attacked me and like in front of everyone, you know? So I definitely encourage us as a community, we do have to kind of take it with a grain of salt sometimes and go a little slower when looking at people's intent. While it's not fair to us and we could wish that everyone just already knew all these definitions and accepted us for who we are, it's just not the world we live in, you know?
Yeah, everybody's at a different place of where they are. There's that whole conversation around intention and impact and deciding when you are going to, again, use that emotional labor to kind of have that space with them and have that conversation, and if they're open to having that as well.
Mm.
Kind of another question that I had for you too, especially in this inclusion space, is there anything that you think in terms of trends or ways that individuals and companies really need to be aware of in order to be successful in the future? Just things you're seeing either from the employer side, or things that employees can expect from their company in the future.
Yeah, so I would say the future thing that a lot of employers are about to be like, holy cow, is the idea of just gender in general. Over 50% of Gen Z, which is, I think the later stages in Gen Z are like
I think
23
so.
years old,
Yeah.
something like that. So they're starting to really come into the workforce, interns and stuff like that. But Gen Z, over 50% of them believe that the binary of male and female is dumb. They just don't get it. They don't understand, why do we have female raisers versus male raisers?
We're pen.
Right? And then over 50% of them also know a gender nonconforming, gender diverse, gender queer, or trans person in their life. They have a friend. So it's becoming more and more around this like idea of gender, of being more fluid. So for companies who are not allowing for more than one gender for more than two genders to be reported on their stuff, for companies that are not allowing gender pronouns, for companies who, I've even seen some companies get backlash from having gender reveal parties because you don't know that baby's gender. That baby can't tell you what their gender is.
That's a whole other conversation. Yeah, gender reveal parties.
Yeah, so it's something that they're going to have to be very aware of, and a lot of these kids are also going to be, probably in the LGBTQ plus community. But I tell recruiters and higher ups, I'm like, if you want a good feel for Gen Z and the way they present gender, just go on TikTok and just float around.
Go on TikTok. Yeah, absolutely. When in doubt, go to TikTok. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that definitely, that makes sense. And that is a trend that we should be looking at too. And I think the data supports that as well. I was just talking to someone else also over at the Trevor Project, and she was sharing data around just LGBTQ youth. And one of the stats was just using gender pronouns and asking someone their pronouns and affirming that lowers the suicide rate by like 50% within youth. So it might be, I've heard before, like, why am I including my pronouns in my signature? But it does make it manifest into these big differences. And I think that's important for folks to know for the future as well. I know we're wrapping up our time together. It went by so quickly, but if you could share one of your proudest moments doing this work, it could be big or small. I would love to know.
Yeah. Oh gosh. So probably one of my proudest moments is doing this work. I've focused really heavily on LGBTQ plus people. And, I think the common theme through today is being counted, right? Being seen. And there were so many recruiters who I talked with who, it wasn't that they didn't want to recruit LGBTQ plus people. It was that we just weren't on their radar, even until I brought it up. And that's not to say that all recruiters are like that or whatever, but it's the vast majority I spoke with. But I just recently presented at the University Recruiting Conference, URX Ford, and I had about 45 people, recruiters from huge companies in there, and seeing the engagement, the questions, the excitement, that just happened maybe like 2 weeks ago. That right there got me like a little teary-eyed, because I was like, oh my gosh, like, because I don't get nervous presenting ever. I'm a very extroverted, like, I can do it, it's whatever. But that one felt a lot of pressure because I was like, this is my chance to get them to understand why it's important to focus on queer people in recruitment.
Yeah.
And I was like, if I mess this up, then there goes a lot of chances for a lot of queer
That's a
people.
lot of pressure. Yeah.
Yeah. And when it went well and I was in my full, like, oh, I was just like in my full, like,
In that moment of flow.
Yes, that flow. And just seeing it like made me teary-eyed just because it was something that I've been for the past year just harping on and having conversations around. So being able to do it in that space and feel that love around it was super cool.
That's amazing. Congratulations. And that's so important. I bet you
you.
reached a lot of folks, and at least, they took away a lot of insights from what you were talking about as well. And again, that exposure is so important to continue to do the internal work for each person individually. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the folks who are listening? And how can they get in touch with you if something you mentioned like really resonated with them?
Sure. Feel free to email me awesomely, or if you feel to email me info@awesomely, AWESOMELY, authentic, AUTHENTIC.com, or you can follow us on Instagram @awesomely_authentic. And I am happy to help with career coaching, DEI inclusion stuff, all that fun stuff. Always happy to answer a question. And thank y'all for listening to me go on and on today.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Matthew, for speaking with me today. I really appreciate it. I think you have great energy and a clear passion for the space and just to help others and make an impact in the world we live in, which is what I love to see. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina.
Of course. And as a reminder, at AllVoices, we believe in the empowerment of everyone to speak up at an organization and think it's a requirement in order for folks to succeed. Have a good rest of your day.